Since all our three presenters are ready for presentation, I would just like formally begin panel 2A, which is titled Circuits of Culture and Power in the Spanish Empire. We have as our first presenter, Christina Lee of Princeton University, to be followed by Mario Roger Quijano of Universidad Veracruzana. And then our third presenter is Carolyn Baicy of University of Hawaii at Manoa. Their presentations will follow each other immediately. So without further ado, let me now turn you over to Christina for her presentation. Christina?
Great, thank you so much. Before I start, I'd like to thank Mike Pante and his colleagues for the work they have done organizing this conference, in spite of the difficulties I'm sure they have experienced. And needless to say, it's an honor to present on this platform as an avid reader of the Journal Philippine Studies. This presentation is a synopsis of a chapter in a larger book project called Saints of Resistance, in which I look at the devotion to Philippine Santos established during the first 200 years of Spanish colonialism. In this book, I look at Santo Niño de Cebu, Our Lady of Kasaysay, Our Lady of Antipolo, and finally, Our Lady of the Rosary of Manila, Naval. So these are the saints that I look at in my project. Today, I'd like to talk about La Naval because unlike the other Santos, is the only one that I have found that was reserved, I mean, really limited to the Spanish population in Manila. The statue of Our Lady of the Rosary La Naval is more physically imposing than other images, whose devotions date back to the early period of Spanish colonialism. Standing at about 145 centimeters and sculpted in ivory, Our Lady of the Rosary commands a spontaneous reverence from the people who approach her. Since the early 17th century, she has been dressed in luxurious silk vestments, heavily embroidered with golden threads and bejeweled in precious stones. Unlike other images with a large following, no one attempts to touch her or her vestment. Rather, the devotees understand that they do not need to be in physical contact or own a relic of her to have their prayers answered. At the same time, her following is limited to a more educated socioeconomic class, to students attending Dominican schools, and to religious professionals who are concerned in approaching their saints with theological correctness and with the proper social protocol. These are devotees who may disagree with the unrestrained show of emotions in the cult to saints with wider mass appeal, such as Our Lady of Antipolo or the Black Nazarene of Quiapo. Our Lady of the Rosary's regal appearance and selected following may be traced to the inception of her devotion at the beginning of the 17th century as the exclusive saint of the Spanish community in Manila. She was embraced by Spanish soldiers, officials, and missionaries with dreams of territorial and spiritual conquest. She was believed to protect even the most despicable Spanish sinner as long as he stayed true to her and to the project of Christianization. In times of conflict, she was the virgin warrior, the saint who resisted the enemies of the Catholic crowns, the Moors of the Pacific, in Mindanao, Sulu, and the Moluccas Islands, the heretical Dutch, and anyone else who attempted to stop Spain's manifest destiny in the Pacific. In what follows, I trace the development of the devotion of Our Lady of the Rosary of Manila from the time the avocation of the Rosary was imported to the Philippines from Europe to the point in which the image acquired the title La Naval in the aftermath of the Dutch War of 1646. Just like the legend of the finding of the image of Santo Niño de Cebu inspired Spaniards from different walks of life to believe that their participation in the conquest was a prodigious event predestined by God, the legend of Our Lady's support of the Spanish forces against the Dutch reminded them that they were the chosen victors in the battle against Christianity in the Spanish Pacific. The devotion to Our Lady of the Rosary in her generalized form, grew in Spain in the aftermath of the victory of the Holy League, the army composed of Spanish, Venetian, and Italian soldiers against the full forces of the Ottoman empires, or the Moors, in the Battle of Lepanto in 1571. For the missionaries of the Dominican order, Our Lady of the Rosary came to represent, more than any other avocation of Mary, the imminent triumph of Christianity in the heathen territories of Asia. Hence, the first Dominican missionaries in the Philippines armed themselves with symbols that reminded them of her patronage. They named their mission the Province of the Holy Rosary of Our Lady and adopted her as a patron saint. The indispensable source for examining the development of the devotion of Our Lady of the Rosary of Manila during the early period of Spanish rule is a dossier containing the investigations of the miracles that established this shrine image as the uncontested devotion of Spaniards. These investigations were conducted by the Dominican order and ultimately sent to the Manila Archbishopric for review. In spite of the name given to the dossier by its compiling, Libro de los Papeles Originales de los Milagros de Nuestra Señora de Rosario, or the book of the original papers of the miracles of Our Lady of the Rosary, the dossier also includes the copy of an investigation of Our Lady's protection against the Dutch invasion of 1646. Some of the cases in the dossier are incomplete, but it is the earliest and richest source we have on the devotion. The dossier is available today in microfilm format in the archives of the University of Santo Tomas. It contains 19 miracle investigations endowed to Spaniards, with the exception of 3, whose recipients were a native woman married to a Spaniard, an Italian woman who was also married to a Spaniard, and a native principal. Diego de Duarte and Baltasar Santa Cruz had access to these cases and summarized them in their respective 1640 and 1693 history of the Dominicans in the Philippines, China, and Japan. In these sources, the saint at hand is called Our Lady of the Rosary of the convent of Santo Domingo in the city of Manila, or just Our Lady of the Rosary of Manila, in order to distinguish her from other local images under the avocation of the Rosary. The first recorded miracles performed by Our Lady of the Rosary of Manila concerned the Virgin's safekeeping of a Spanish legation missionaries in their voyage to the Japanese province of Hisen and her intervention in the conquest of the Moluccas in 1606 by Governor Pedro Bravo de Acuña. But I like to focus on the miracle that caused the surge of the devotion to Our Lady of the Rosary among the general population of Spanish residents in Manila. This miracle concerned a Spanish Creole soldier named Francisco Lopez from New Spain, that is Mexico, who was about to die after being attacked by Mindanao natives, but thanks to the intervention of Our Lady of the Rosary, he was able to live until he was given his last rites. This was the miracle that popularized the devotion of Our Lady of the Rosary among Spaniards of all ranks and professions. The story of Francisco Lopez became widely known among Spaniards in Manila by the time the investigation took place in 1621. The Manila-based friar Francisco Hurtado published a melodramatic version of the miracle in 1634 in the form of a pamphlet with the title Relation of the Marvelous Miracle. It was published in Seville with the objective of promoting the success of the devotion to Our Lady of the Rosary of Manila in Spain. Diego Duarte additionally included the case of Lopez in the 12th chapter of his Historia. The investigation of the miracle was conducted 8 years after the incident. According to the investigation, the soldier Francisco Lopez was a gunner of the troop under the command of Francisco Uribe. The Spanish force was en route to Ternate when a storm hit the ship on the coast of Mindoro, destroying and disbanding its crew. The galley slaves, Mindanao natives, took the opportunity to run away into the highlands. The Spanish crew followed the escaped natives uphill, but the natives attacked them with rocks, killing them all, except for Francisco Lopez. He was later found by the crew of another Spanish ship en route to Ternate. All the witnesses of the investigation state that by the time they found Francisco Lopez, His physical appearance was that of a living cadaver with the crown of his head partly detached and worms creeping in and out of his nose and every open wound in his body. The Dominican Francisco de Ugaba, in his summary of the case, said that Lopez was, I quote, so disfigured that they did not think that it was possible for him to have survived naturally. Francisco Lopez represented for the Spanish elite, the typical but also expendable Spanish or Spanish American migrant sent to the Philippines. The Spanish crown had difficulty recruiting Spanish soldiers and mariners willing to serve in Asia, and therefore had to draw their conscripts partly from the pool of Spaniards who were found traveling illegally from Seville to Mexico, as well as the population of vagabonds and indigents found in New Spain. About 20 years after the Manila-Acapulco trade began, Governor Gomez Perez das Mariñas complained to the king about the low quality of the military due to this issue. In Mexico, he wrote, there is an abusive practice that they use to clean that land from the criminal and evil men, which is to banish them to the Philippines with the titles of soldiers so that they can serve your majesty. But they are only good to ruin this land, teaching bad vices and habits to the people here that they have learned there. So there is not a single good man here. A quarter of all soldiers sent to the Philippines between 1600s and 1690 were criminals, highwaymen, and runaway soldiers. Gaspar de San Agustin expressed the same complaint almost in the same terms as delinquent types continued to crowd the Trans-Pacific galleys en route to the Philippines. These characters were fictionalized in literature in works such as Carlos de Singüesa's Misfortunes of Alonso Ramirez and Vicente Alemany's The Adventures of Don Pablo in Mexico and Filipinas. What this miracle told members of the Spanish enclave in Manila was that Our Lady of the Rosary protected even the worst and the most sinful men among them, as long as they stayed true to the Christianization project of the Spanish crown. To the Spanish community in Manila, Lopez alluded to the stereotype of the abusive soldier who tricked fellow Spaniards, used extortion and torture when collecting tributes for the encomenderos, openly stole from natives and then gambled it all away. This depraved man, however, was shown to have gained redemption because of this unwavering faith to the image of Our Lady of the Rosary and to her cause, the war against the enemies of Christianity. To the lowly ranked, conscripted men like Lopez, with no other capital than the Spanish ethnicity, Our Lady of the Rosary gave him hope that even when fallen to the most despicable condition, they would not die alone. Our Lady of the Rosary of Manila began to be called La Naval by her devotees after she was believed to have led the Spanish armies to a victory against the Dutch in the naval battles of 1646 in Philippine waters. The details of the naval conflict highlighted in the retelling of the legend and websites and commemorational materials approved by the Church of Santo Domingo, where she's housed, are based on Baltasar de Santa Cruz 1693 sequel to the Duarte's Historia. By reading the testimonies of the investigation, including in the dossier of the miracles in the archives of the University of Santo Tomas, allows us to understand even more poignantly why Our Lady of the Rosary was seen by the Spanish as their own saint of resistance. In these testimonies, we can sense the soldiers' fear of dying in a foreign land they wished to escape, and the anxieties they felt upon knowing that the Spanish position in the Pacific was at risk. In fact, while the Spanish controlled key areas in the Philippines, such as Trans-Pacific galleon trade, such control was all but secure, and Spanish officials, missionaries, and soldiers lived in constant fear of being attacked not only by the Dutch, whose shadows seemed to continuously hover over the Philippines, but also the English and the Portuguese, who were at times allies and at times friends. There were the Chinese pirates threatening attacks, the powerful armies of the newly risen Qing dynasty, as well as the Chinese Manila, on whom they relied for trade and daily life, but never trusted. In addition, there were the usual frustrations with the continuous native non-compliance in the Philippine highlands and the inability to conquer Mindanao and Jolo. Given this context, we can understand the enormous angst the Spanish forces in Manila felt when they finally saw the Dutch drawing closer in February of 1646 with a squadron of ships and almost 3 times as many soldiers as they had. The statements describe the gunners in the Spanish ships hanging images of Our Lady around their cannons. Prior to shooting their targets, gunners would invoke the name of Our Lady, our most holy Virgin of the Rosary, so the artillery targets would strike with greater force, unquote. One captain recalled that an image of Our Lady of the Rosary hung in a cannon smiled at the soldiers during battle. All witnesses marvel at the fact that their number of casualties was so low, between 14 and 16, given the profuse number of cannons and gunshots that the Spanish galleons suffered during the 5 battles. The portrayal of Our Lady of the Rosary that arises from the investigation is one of a virgin warrior, hence La Naval. The Spanish and their allies in Manila needed a saint who would assert their martial roles as the champions of the Christian faith, and Our Lady of the Rosary fulfilled this need. The 1646 battles against the Dutch were their lepanto, and the soldiers who participated in it wished to see themselves recognized for their heroic roles. The witnesses of the investigation state that all the men of the Spanish naval forces joined a procession to thank Our Lady of the Rosary against the Dutch. This all, however, did not include the native soldiers and aides. The Spanish soldiers who testified only occasionally mentioned the Pampango soldiers who had participated in this conflict. The lack of recognition of the role of natives in the legend of the miracles of La Naval is consistent with the practice of limiting access to the Virgin to only members of the Spanish community in Manila. In a stained glass in the interior of the Santo Domingo church designed by Galo Ocampo in 1954, we see the Battle of Lepanto on the right-hand side window with stereotyped Spaniards in knight armor overpowering their Muslim enemies with their swords. Above the battle, a figure representing Pope Pius V prays the Rosary. On the left pane, we see an episode during one of the 1646 battles against the Dutch. Spanish and native soldiers are shown in a boat praying to La Naval, who looms largely above the sea. One of the native soldiers in the boat is holding tightly to a little statue of La Naval with his hands. In the background, we see a large Dutch ship drawing closer. These 2 decisive moments in the history of European and Asian Christianity, respectively, are united by the middle panel, which shows the Virgin holding out her rosary to Saint Dominic, and the Virgin's child doing the same with Saint Catherine of Siena. Ocampo suggests that the battles against the Dutch were as significant as the Battle of Lepanto in the history of global Christianity. Moreover, Ocampo seems to want to highlight the participation of Philippine natives in these battles. In the depiction of the battle against the Dutch on the left pane, there are 5 native soldiers, 4 of them in the foreground, 3 Spanish ones, and the Dominican friar in the ship. The message is clear. As Our Lady of the Rosary allowed the Spanish Armada to defeat Islam in the Mediterranean Sea, she showed that the Spanish Armada was to continue the fight for Catholicism, this time against Protestantism in the Pacific Sea. For Ocampo, this mission could not be possible without the participation of the Philippine natives. The images shown in the stained glass show Ocampo's effort to decolonize the history of the famed battles against the Dutch by showing the active roles of the natives in the conflict. In the same spirit, the high relief above the middle entry doors to the Church of Santo Domingo reinsert the role of the natives in the procession that gave Our Lady of the Rosary the title of La Naval. The sculptor of the relief, Francesco Monto, more specifically recalls the fulfillment of the vow by the Spanish forces after the 5th battle, after they walked barefoot from the port of Cavite to Our Lady of the Rosary shrine after the 5th battle.
Hi,
At the
Christina.
center,
Sorry. Excuse me.
yes.
May I ask you to wrap it up in around 3 minutes?
Yes.
Okay.
At the center of the relief stands a large figure of La Naval, who is especially recognizable by her heavy eyelids and bejeweled dress. A group of Spaniards and natives are facing the Virgin while in prayer. Two of the Spaniards are Dominican friars who kneel on each side of the Virgin and holding rosaries. On the right side of the Virgin, between two Spanish soldiers, we see two Philippine natives with their sights fixed on the image. On the left side, one of the two Spanish soldiers is holding a cross. On the same side, but in proximity to the Virgin, there are two natives also in prayer, one of whom is in a visibly emotional state. Although the natives are presented in humbler clothes and demeanor, they stand as tall and as dignified as the Spanish authorities. The stained glass and the high relief at the Church of Santo Domingo serve as a corrective for the virtual absence of native agents in the narratives that establish the devotion to Our Lady of the Rosary in La Naval. Our Lady of finishing up here, Our Lady of the Rosary de Naval was the most sought after Spanish devotion in the Philippines of early Spanish rule. It appealed to the missionary ambitions and the martial spirit of the Spaniards and Creoles who ventured to the far end of the Pacific. Her devotees embraced her cult because her miracles reinforced what they believed to be Spain's predestined role in the Pacific as a cross-bearer against all heathens and heretics. Our Lady of La Naval would have been appealing to Spanish subjects who did not feel identified with the troubles of lowly natives, Chinese and mestizos, but who deeply felt their precarious condition in the utmost western boundary of the Spanish Indies. Although Spaniards held political dominance in the Philippine lowlands, in times of conflict and political insecurity, they found comfort in the idea that they were intrinsic to the Christianizing mission of Asia, which they viewed as a continuation of the reconquest, the conquest of the Americas, and the war against Islam in the Mediterranean. For the Spaniards in Manila, La Naval was their saint of resistance, the saint who was ready to oppose any foreign, heathen, or heretical power who threatened the survival and livelihood of the Spanish project in the Pacific. Philippine natives viewed La Naval as Spanish through and through and did not show interest in partaking in her devotion. They had their own saints of resistance, in any case, who helped them cope with the hardships brought to them, in no small part by Spanish wars and commercial interests. As I discussed elsewhere, they had Our Lady of Antipolo, the Virgin who protected them against the destructive forces brought about by colonialism.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you very much to Ateneo de Manila, and thank you to everyone who they are just doing a fantastic job. Well, I'm going to talk about Sarswella. Well, this is from Lavapiés to Tondo, and this research began with La España Artística, a magazine that started its publication in 1888 from Madrid. This source is not only interesting in terms of the Philippines, but to a large part of the lyrical world of the time, as it recounts news from theaters in Spain, both of the great lyrical centers such as Madrid and Barcelona, as well as those of medium relevance. It also gives reviews from Brussels, London, Paris, Rome, or St. Petersburg, and from overseas cities such as Buenos Aires, Caracas, Bogota, Havana, Mexico City, and even Tangier or Cairo. Likewise, this paper was enhanced by the hemerographic sources provided by Dr. William Summers from Dathon University, which contain detailed information on theatrical activities in the Philippines in the second half of the 19th century. To him goes my admiration and my gratitude. The purpose of this work is sharing a recent outline from the new testimonies, which will encourage attention on the subject. Well, first, case study timeline. The visit in 1852 of the Compañía del Teatro del Balón de Cádiz, with its manager Manuel Lopez de Ariza and the staging of El Tío Canillitas by Soriano Fuertes, have been considered as a significant record for the beginnings of Sarswella in the islands. However, previously deported Hispanic politicians and local artists were already performing Sarswella with the resources that they had. The Diario de Manila, published in February 13, 1851, that at the Teatro del Carrillo was performed together with other sainetes and entremeses, the two acts Zarzuela El Duende, with music by Rafael Hernando and libretto by Luis Olona, together with Colegialas y Soldados with libretto by Mariano Pina, both premiered in Madrid in 1849, began a new period of the Spanish lyric theater, known now as Restored Sarswella, to differentiate it from the previous Baroque one. On February 19, 1851, El Duende staged at the Binondo Theater with the company of Narciso de Escosura, one of the politicians deported to Manila. Since 1849, Escosura was known into the theatrical venues of Manila. Quote, "The appearance of Mr. Escosura in our theater has been a real triumph for him. We are very looking forward to his eminent artistic faculties and his zealous activity that he has already given us such amazing examples." Text. He continued acting Zarzuelas in the Binondo Theater, among them a work by Agustín Ascona, El Sacristán de San Lorenzo, a parody of Donizetti, Lucia de la Mermur, set in Lavapiés Square and between Majos and Majas. At the other end of the timeline, the scope of this present takes us until the second decade of the 20th century, when Zarzuela artists performed the Viennese operettas, while new American musical fads were developing at the same time, like the jazz arrival. Even more, singers and actors moved to cinematography, whose early themes came from theater and zarzuelas. Artists remain famous, as it can be seen in the publications like the comic satirical weekly Kikeriki. However, wrote under the pseudonym Papaya, reviewed zarzuelas and operettas that were presented such as El Método Goritz, Alma de Dios, or La Viuda Alegre, the Merry Widow, as well as he dedicated to the artist some jocular verses under their cartoons. The examination of previous sources and addition of recent ones favor an expansion of the chronological space of the existence of the zarzuela into the Filipino culture, even in the American period. 2. Lyrical and dramatic genres. It is helpful to relate the Spanish zarzuela with the other lyrical arts in vogue. To a large extent, zarzuela was presented in functions covering other scenic genres such as opera, operetta, dance, comedies, sainetes, entremeses, musical interludes, etc. The scheme of these years was to include short zarzuelas or part of them, starting the performance with that they called sinfonia, and they generally gave it to the right name of miscellaneous, as seen in the following function in Quiapo in 1860. In order to dimension the impact of zarzuela and its place in the preferences of theatrical activities, it is necessary to take into account the historiography of the other performing arts during that time, because constantly in the printing press they were mingled and roughly received equal diffusion. Local plays. Among the development of lyrical activities, it started to appear evidence of artistic syncretism. Some texts of zarzuelas begin to be translated into Tagalog, such as Buenas noches, Señor Don Simón, apparently the first one translated into Tagalog and offered at the Tondo Theater in February 1854. The same with El Duende, that it was performed in the Sibacon Theater in Tagalog in 1855. Regarding about the musical content, it began to include regional topics, as El Comercio points out that Mr. Fernandez also performed a vogantao in Visayan, accompanying himself in the harp, and that he ended up singing a cundiman in Tagalog and some malagueñas in Spanish. This will be a gesture that will be seen in the following decades, such as when artists like Elisea Raguer or Nemesio Ratia sang the melodies in vernacular languages. If zarzuela had already been translated into Tagalog and included vernacular music, local plays developed too. Already since Lopez de Ariza's season, a local play made its debut at the Binondo Theater in May 18, 1852. Salir a Tiempo de Pobre by Antonio Robles. Although in its beginning, it was not entirely successful, the one that more remained within the repertoire was El Viaje Redondo, Zarzuela of Filipino customs in one act and in verse by Regina Escalera, with music by Ignacio Mazaguer. Then came the famous Cuadros Filipinos by Francisco de Paula Entrada, premiered by the Alejandro Cubero's company in 1882, which pointed out the excess of Tagalog comedy. More works by local authors would come, so it was a very company-friendly custom. Geographical roots. As a pilgrim lyrical genre, overhauling the surrounding places is indispensable to continue sizing the Sarswella presence. There will be companies that arrive directly from Spain, but some will take advantage one way or return, especially opera, to perform some season in the nearby ports of Batavia, actually Jakarta, Hong Kong, Macau, or Shanghai. Just as there were certain routes already known in the American continent, such as those in the Pacific or the Caribbean, it already worth the effort to do a deep search about these routes in Southeast Asia, but interrelated to lyrical customs and genres. Interesting, it is the troop trip destined for Manila, departed from Gibraltar, and the time that it takes to arrive in, because the ship changes. Oh. Certainly, in Southeast Asia, the opera traveled more than the Sarswella, and Manila was a point to make season, and from there to continue to another country. But in 1887, Cuba's Spanish Sarswella troupe, established in the Philippines since 1881, tried a season in Hong Kong, with some of the musicians who had only gone to Marikina or Antipolo in their lives. The troupe returned with a bad taste in its mouth. For our case study, when examining opera activities, we can find data that gives information such as identifying characters related to Sarswella, for example, Alfredo Gore or Drusilla Bertolini, who collaborated in events of some Spanish companies. 5, the repertoire. Nowadays, the current sources will allow a list of all the works submitted by year, theater, company, etc. This will reveal those plays that were most favored by the public or by companies. This will confirm the permanence of a repertoire and its validity, as well as changes in musical taste or fashions. The most important titles of the Spanish Zarzuela began to be known in 1855, as we can see at the premiere in Tondo of Los Diamantes de la Corona by Barbieri, or just as Arrieta's Marina began to be listened in 1860, as reviewed in the press. Quote, brilliant arias and choirs with recitations, parts of this distinguished Zarzuela, in which another amateur will also take part. Text. If for this decade there is an assortment of titles, it is significant that with the first performing of El Potosí Submarino, the Spanish Teatro Bufo entered into the insular repertoire. The witty thing is that made it in the usual miscellaneous. Some events will be resized, such as the case of Pascual Bailón, one of the peculiar anecdotes of Sarswella in Manila because of its performing in August 1886, and its daring dance that triggered the ecclesiastical hierarchy to publish a note criticizing the show. The work was known by the Manilans since 1881 when entered the local repertoire, so one will wonder why 5 years later it will become a scandal. It's well-known can-can. From the historical sources, it seems that the repertoire was limited and repetitive, but a 6-decade study from 1850 to 1911 will present another reality besides being able to deduce the time between a Madrid premiere and its respective in Manila. 6, local troops and their development. The arrival from Spain of Alejandro Cubero and Elise Arraguer marked a new path of the Manila theater life. Since 1881 and over the course of 6 years, they professionalized those local artists who will soon become leading figures in the Philippine theater circles. Although the companies used to make tours into the provinces, it appears that Filipino artist companies will come to create a significant spread of the genre. Resulting from this and the presence of Sarswella and its format, there was a development of local plays in towns like Pampanga, Iloilo, Batangas, etc. There are quite a few traces of these visits to the provinces and their manifestations in artistic activities. Theaters and private spaces. There are exciting studies on Filipino theaters. Next, like the genres, it will be recommendable to cross information since it's very peculiar, the close interaction that was among them. Remarkable is that the one company was in a theater on Thursday and then on Sunday performed in another one, and the same between companies, that they took turns on weekdays or weekends for their performances, and others set in spaces or even artists of themselves. The Sarswella studies must address semi-private areas such as artistic associations and other events. For example, religious celebrations, liturgical onomastics, village festivals, in commemoration of their foundation or patron saint, etc., to which the troops were hired to participate in the various days that the feast could last. Perhaps the most known example is José Rizal's Junto al Pasic, a short piece composed on request to be represented by students of the Ateneo de Manila and staged at 6 p.m. on Wednesday, December 8, 1880 at the institution Salón de Actos. Customs and practices. One of the gorgeous pages of Zarzuela in Asia belongs to the part of customs and practices. For example, the Función de Beneficio adopts special performances to celebrate the actors with splendid and lavish gifts offered to the singers by the public or government authorities. The hooks to attract attendees either through functions with raffles or, as in the case of the Navarro's company season started in Tondo, given transport services to the performances used to end late at night. The functions were longer, as we saw lines about. Quote, the show ended wee hours. At 12 o'clock, a dance and 2 zarzuelas were missing. This is what annoys you because it makes the public yawn and prevents you from going to your next day's obligations with the punctuality you want. Text. Functions were conditioned by the weather. The Manilans had arranged a practical communication when it came to climate contingencies. Quote, if the function is suspended tonight because of the bad weather, the public will be notified by means of an incarnate lantern that will be placed at the top of the flagpole of the theater, and by a transparent one that will be placed on the big bridge and another on the bridge of Santa Cruz. Text. The Variedad Theater in Manila had a peculiar building structure which made it possible that the functions could be listened outside. So those who did not enter for some reason stood outdoors without having to buy a ticket. The theater decided that whoever guarded the entrance will go out to ask people to continue on their path. Well, there is more and more interesting pictures of the Spanish zarzuela in the Philippines, but it's just to present, not to be so straight in a kind of research, but it's more three-dimensional. Like this is some examples, but indeed there are, by the way, for example, the military bands. It's another path very interesting to research. But well, after all, based on the foregoing, possible path of study can be set out to deepen and learn more about this scenario, which it was the farthest one from the court from Spain, to which a versatile genre arrived and that it was well received. The Spanish Sarswella is part of the history of the performing arts of the Philippines and one of the most suggestive chapters in the history of this lyrical genre. Maraming salamat po.
Maraming salamat din, Mario. Thank you very much for your presentation.
It was a pleasure.
So today I'm going to be discussing specifically this colonial exposition of 1887, entitled the Exposición General de las Islas Filipinas. My Spanish is not as good as Mario and Christina's, so I apologize for any mistakes. But anyways, I wanted to focus specifically on this exposition because it has received little attention in comparison to the more monumental Philippine exposition at the 1904 World's Fair within Philippine historiography. So when this 1887 exposition is mentioned, it predominantly focuses really on Ilustrado reactions to the cultural performers of the Cordilleras, as seen in John Schumacher, Raquel Reyes, and Megan Thomas's monographs on Ilustrado politics, identity, and scholarship. So the purpose of this presentation is really to discuss and analyze the significance of visuality in relation to this colonial display and its multimedia, the multimedia nature of it. So before I begin, I wanted to really contextualize this Philippine exposition by focusing really on some historical events that influenced the ideologies and processes of imagining the Philippines at this exposition. So first and foremost, we have political and social unrest in the Philippines at this time period with the Cavite Revolt in the 1870s, but we also have anxieties pertaining specifically to the looming threats of expansion by other European colonial powers into the Pacific. This is evident in really the contestations pertaining to the ownership of the Caroline Islands between Germany and Spain in 1885, with which required really the arbitration of Pope Leo XIII, who sided with the Spanish crown. So in addition to these social unrests in the Philippine archipelago, as well as competing colonialisms in the Pacific, we also have various wars of independence, which essentially leads to the loss of Spain's American colonies. In addition to that, they wanted to really locate themselves within the context of Spain as a glorious empire. So there was this desire within this colonial exposition to display the glory of Spanish colonial history. And it's evident really in the prologue to this collection of articles written in El Globo, a periodical relating specifically to this colonial exposition. So as stated in this passage, there's this sense of necessity in displaying the significance of Spain as an empire, in which their achievements should be memorialized, to be displayed, and to be known, which really provides this, it really underscores the discourses that really are present within this colonial exposition. In addition to the historical context, I wanted to really briefly discuss this theoretical, or this framework I'm utilizing to analyze visuality at this colonial exposition. So I'm using this concept of the panoramic panoptic, which combines two interrelated concepts. So the panorama collapses space and narrative into a singular field of vision. And it's evident in the physical spatial planning of the fairgrounds, the process of collecting materials, images, and people to display within the metropole, and the usage of montage in print media to encapsulate the entirety of the fair experience. In addition to that, we have the panoptic gaze taken from Michel Foucault's Discipline and Punishment, and also utilized by Tori Bennett in analyzing museum displays, which highlights the control of space through the idea of a silent, unknown overseer. As noted by Foucault, and is evident later on as I discuss, this process of surveillance, in this process of surveillance, power becomes dispersed and also internalized in both the observer and the observed. So in the case of the colonial exposition as a site of panoramic panoptics, citizens of the metropole are essentially allowed to participate in the process of surveilling colonized subjects, wherein these cultural performers in this exposition must ignore the observers and perform authentic everyday life. We can also see it within this print from the journal La Ilustración Española y Americana, where we have Igorots, Anaita, Moros, and Pacific Islanders situated here, surrounded by government officials, dignitaries, and members of the aristocracy. And standing on the other side of the aisle are members, are Visayan and Tagalog men and women who are representative of this Hispano-Philippine culture and are presented as more civilized. So the physical placement of these bodies and their reproduction in popular media provided direct contrasts between the representatives of Spain and the Philippines, in which the language of civilizational attainment and modernity become visually codified. Here also, what we see is that the Spanish colonies are represented through physical bodies of these individuals, collapsing space, and presented under the gaze of the Queen Regent, Maria Christina, who becomes the representative of the ultimate authority of the Spanish Empire. So the two key buildings in this colonial exposition that housed the displays for it was the Palacio de Velázquez and the Palacio de Cristal. So the Palacio de Velázquez was divided into 8 thematic sections that really narrated Spain's presence within the Philippines, as well as what happens without Spanish presence. So images of what would be deemed as non-Christian tribes or primitive groups in the context of, say, in contrast to, say, images or paintings created by Christian Filipinos from Manila and Ilocos. So what we see here in the Palacio Velázquez is the 8 thematic sections. One is the nature of the Spanish territories in Oceania. Second is population. Third is army and armed auxiliaries of the administration. Fourth is navy. Fifth is botanical geography of the archipelago. Sixth is agriculture and horticulture. Seventh is industry and commercial activities. And finally, culture. So the Palacio Velázquez was previously built to house an 1883 exposition on minerals and metallurgy, but the Palacio de Cristal was built specifically for this exposition and recalls the expositional language of the Crystal Palace at the 1851 Universal Exposition in London. In doing so, Spain connected itself to the monumental expositions of the past, which exhibited notions of Euro-American modernity. And by mimicking the trappings of the modern empire, Spanish exposition organizers attempted to reassert their standing as a strong modern empire that is in control of their colonies, their people, and their commerce. It's also important, or it's also a bit of an important side note, but the Palacio de Cristal was actually initially meant to be taken apart and shipped to the Philippines to house collections for the 1895 regional exposition in Manila. So in direct contrast to these images of modernity, we have located outside, yet close to, these symbols of imperial power, the Rancheria de Igorotes, where all of the non-Christian Filipinos and Pacific Islanders resided for the duration of the exposition. Close by to this rancheria were an exhibition of exotic animals from the archipelago. So in separating, what was particularly interesting is the fact that separating the rancheria from the 2 exhibition buildings is a man-made river, which also tried to provide a sense of authenticity for native Filipino space and actively separated Spanish modernity from, I guess, what you would consider as non-Christian primitivity. In addition, it also allowed for visitors to move on the river in boats manned by Filipinos to view this move specifically from buildings that are symbolic of modernity into Edenic renterias, and in turn creates this narrative, this symbolic narrative of individuals that are, of the status of individuals that are seen as outside of the control of the Spanish Empire. In addition, this boating expedition was a way for visitors to take a trip around the world, seeing the sights and people performing daily life without leaving the capital. The spatial and ideological planning of the exposition is thus really located in these visual idioms that I previously introduced of the panoramic panoptic, which submerge the visitors in the colonies without leaving the metropole, and in turn collapse the distance between colony and capital, as well as between modern and primitive. This totalizing view is spatially reproduced, but it took on another form in two-dimensional medium. So in another illustration for La Ilustración Española y Americana, we see printed montages of various views of the Philippine exposition, and which provide another totalizing experience of the entire exposition within a single page or even a single vision. So by collapsing the landscape into two-dimensional space, the panoramic views and the image become further controlled through compositional elements, and presents these direct contrasts between metropolitan modernity and primitive colony. As seen here, what we can see is that the Palacio de Cristal is placed at the center of this montage, and are surrounded by vignettes of the colony or the Philippine archipelago, with the Palacio Velasquez at the top. So in this composition, what we see is a privileging of the images or symbols of Spanish authority and knowledge being surrounded by what it is attempting to contain. In addition to visualizing and controlling space, bodies and the ordering of race were visually controlled, not just in cultural performances, but as I will discuss later, also in the process of creating and curating museum displays within the Palacio de Velasquez. So what we see here is that through cultural performances of savagery, which by the way will be expanded upon by the American colonial officials, as well as even later the Philippine nation state, most represented by the history of our races, which was a parade that began the Miss Universe pageant of 1974. But what we see is that these displays were carefully selected, and people were required to present curated visions of the colonies in familiar spaces, and in turn allowed for empire to be domesticated and translated into visual and popular idioms. The movement of these cultural performers colonized people from different parts of Spain's oceanic empire together into the center of the Spanish colonial world, both physically and psychologically. The physical movement of colonized bodies directly into Madrid asserts a sense of physical control over geographic space and its associated inhabitants. Psychologically, it allowed for the Spanish public to gaze upon the physical representations of Spanish control and created a sense of belonging to the imperial project in which the public can participate and support the processes of empire. So in addition to these physical and psychological aims in utilizing human displays, the visceral nature of displaying colonial bodies within the context of Spain allowed for a visual measurement of notions of Western modernity in progress. By allowing visual display and performance as a measurement of civilization and modernity, Spanish colonial officials deployed a more vernacular language that could be accessible and translatable to the general public. The measurement of modernity not only compared Spain to its colonies, but also to those who are deemed outside of the realm of Christianity, as well as connected it to this larger history of colonial ideologies of display, collecting, and institutional knowledge that was deployed elsewhere in Europe. So the Rancheria Igorote des Igorotes was supposed to be a mirror image of the life of an Igorot village and provided a space for fairgoers to place Spain within modernity and non-Christian Filipinos outside of it, especially as it becomes marked with notions of superstition outside of the realm of the civility of Christianity. We can see this here in this, this description specifically of the beginnings of this, what the promoters called fiestas salvajes, or savage festivals, where Igorots performed sacrificial rituals that were a site of spectacle and titillation for experiencing savagery and primitivity in both the press and general public. So in my translation, what I've noted was the fact that even this process of music becomes a site specifically of highlighting the lack of civility in Igorots, wherein the sound of a bronze gong becomes equated with the vibrations of a hellish noise rather than that of music. So finally, what we have also is the fact that this idea of race wasn't just deployed in cultural performances, but also in the intertwining of various medias, as seen in the anthropological display at the Palacio de Velázquez, where you have the combining not only of collected human remains, but it being combined with images of, still images of living people. In this anthropological display in the Palacio de Velázquez, what we see is an ordering of types, where physical skulls brought in from the archipelago were separated into various races and attached to still images of the living. In addition to this anthropological display actively utilized this narrative of wave migration as developed by Blumentritt and later actually expanded on by Henry Otley Beyer, who was influenced to study the Philippines after the 1904 World's Fair. But anyways, these displays utilize the materiality of the skulls taken from various grave sites by individuals collecting specimens on the ground for the exposition to provide the sense of real scientific proof of diverse, fragmented, non-homogeneous races and cultures in the Philippines. And in turn, were also actively cataloged by the photographs, which marks notions of civility through states of dressed and undressed. Furthermore, these images had various various previous lives and as well as afterlives from the 1887 colonial exposition, but they were deployed in the similar language as a means of marking non-homogeneous cultural diversity, which also was utilized later on by the American colonial period as a means of justifying the American presence in the archipelago. By locating perceived civilizational differences, the Spanish colonial exposition deployed a visual language that worked with spatial planning in order to highlight Spain as a modern country as well as a modern empire, providing a sense of national pride as well as paternalism in as it becomes their duty in these displays and narrations to guide uncivilized or non-Christian colonial subjects into the light of civility. So to conclude, the 1887 exposition provided a space for understanding how Spain located itself and its remaining colonies in a larger discourse of display. However, rather than summarizing what I've presented here, I wanted to conclude by highlighting the legacy of the Spanish exposition, especially as we turn back to the Philippine archipelago and as well as to the American colonial period. First and foremost, what we see is that there is already an established presence of Igorots or Igorot cultural performers moving through metropole. By 1904 and later, these individuals, cultural performers, were aware of this ability to move through performing notions of daily life. They entered into contracts starting with the 1887 colonial exposition to be paid prior to, during, and after their work in these colonial expositions. I'm happy to go into this a bit more. They were also negotiating their contracts as well because of this the fact that they had in the during the 1904 World's Fair, because of the fact that they had this experience and this was a lived memory. Furthermore, what we have also is the fact that the racial discourse that is developed within the this Spanish colonial exposition becomes expanded upon later on in the 1904 World's Fair and after, when Henry Otley Beyer goes to the Philippines and really expands upon Ferdinand Blumentreit's wave migration theory. Finally, what we see here is the fact that even this idea of spatial planning as an indicator of modernity and power becomes also evident within the 1904 World's Fair, as well as the other World's Fair that come after the 1904 one, to indicate America's presence as a colonial power. So yeah, thank you for your time.
Thanks, Caroline. With that, we end our presentations for this panel, and the floor is now open. Anyone from the audience? Feel free to click on the raise hand function. Yes, Kirby?
Hi, do you hear me?
Yes, Kirby, we can hear you clearly.
Good morning to everyone. I have two questions for Caroline. Yes, okay. So the first one is, how can you locate the 1887 Exposición General de Filipinas in the context of the series of expositions that happened in Europe at that time? There was a series in Barcelona, in Paris, etc. So how can you locate how unique was the 1887 exposition in the context of those series of expositions? And the second question is, in your research, did you include the criticisms of the propagandists or Filipino students in Madrid at that time? For example, Rizal was very explicitly criticized the 1887 exposition, particularly when some of the people who were brought into Spain died because of certain illnesses. And he criticized the 1887 exposition. But if you're going to look at some of his letters, 2 years after, in the 1889 Paris exposition, he commended the one particular exhibit there, particularly the exhibit of some Sioux Indians in that exposition. So yeah, those are my questions.
So yeah, really locating Philippines, this Exposición Regional General de las Islas Filipinas, it's the fact that Spanish exposition organizers were actively recalling a lot of these previous expositions. So while it was not unique in the fact that it wasn't the first colonial exposition, or it wasn't the first exposition to really utilize human zoos, it's unique in the fact that this is the first time we actually have non-Christian Filipinos participating within a colonial exposition. And noted in Luis Angel Sanchez Gomez's work is the fact that these individuals actually had pay stubs. So they were entering into contracts to participate and to perform for this exposition. And since it was in 1887, we consider the fact that later on, by 1904, there were multiple individuals that were signing up to participate. It was a lived memory, and it was obvious that there not only was it a site for adventure, as noted by Patricia Fable in her article, but it was also a site for Igorots to enter into the wage economy, because they were entering into contracts and they were being paid to really present, I guess, stereotypical images of Philippine savagery. So onto your second question, I wanted to focus, I could blather on about expositions, but I wanted to really focus on this idea of visuality. But yeah, there was a lot of criticism by the Ilustrados of this 1887 exposition. We have Rizal angry at the fact that there were several individuals that died due to exposure. But we also have one of the Luna brothers actually hating the fact that there were Igorots specifically in Madrid because he did not want to be equated with them. According to him, and then even later on when we moved on to the 1904 World's Fair, the pensionados, Igorots weren't Filipino. They were considered as separate and they were not part of the citizenship of the time. So in my research, I actually note the fact that even the Ilustrado reactions specifically to this 1887 exposition they're not monolithic. They're very dependent on the individual as well as their vision of what it means to be Filipino and what it means to be representative of the Philippine archipelago. Does that answer your questions?
Yes, thank you. Particularly on the reaction of the Luna brothers, because as you may know, they are Ilocanos, and you can equate, or you can include the fact that there's a cultural rift between certain regional groups or ethnic groups in the Philippines at that time. Thank you, Caroline.
Okay, thank you, Kirby and Caroline. Now we have a question from Brother Carl Gaspar, a question for Christina. What theological discourse or discourses were popular within the Spanish Roman Catholic Church that provided the theological foundation for their belief in their manifest destiny and legitimized their aggressive proselytization campaign to the point where force was used, for example, in persecuting the Babaylans?
I don't actually look at a lot of theological writings. What I do is I look at primary sources that come from accounts, investigations, in some cases, trials, church investigations. I look at a lot of I do look at relaciones and accounts written by Jesuits and Augustinians, Dominicans. These are the people writing about the images. That I think it's important to make the distinction between the intellectual discourses about the practice, about religious practices, and the popular practices of that we see in the Philippines. And so I don't engage at the very high level because I'm actually interested in understanding what it is that mostly how indigenous people look at these practices and why is it that they gravitate towards these devotions when these devotions are being imposed on them, oftentimes by people who are also inflicting a lot of violence on them. So I don't, unless there's the discussion arises in a specific miracle, I don't really deal with theological discourses. And also we need to remember that the Spanish who came to the Philippines were not necessarily the most learned. Some of them were more than others. Murillo Velarde, of course, he was very learned. San Agustin perhaps a little bit less. I mean, so, and then they brought their ways of practicing religion, which were not necessarily theologically correct. They brought the way they learn religion from their hometowns, and oftentimes that was in the Basque Country or in little villages. And so they, you know, they pray to icons and wanted favors from icons, from objects, in a way that was not necessarily theologically correct. And they actually encouraged that among the natives. So I don't know, that doesn't answer your question, but and oh yeah, so sorry, I'm reading your question here. Yes, well, that's because I don't see it in the so the way I trace the devotion to La Naval, and this is really surprising. It was very surprising to me because I thought when I started working on it, I thought I was going to find a lot of instances of Chinese, actually, you know, of Chinese devotees. But and that was because of this legend that she was carved by a Chinese artisan. But I didn't I mean, I just didn't find it in the sources. What I do is I go as early as I can with the primary sources, and I look for how was this practice? What are they saying? Why are they? What are the miracles saying about the people who are practicing the devotion? So, yeah, William Christian Jr. is a well-known religious studies scholar. He studied mostly devotions in Spain of the 16th century, and he says, you know, when the devotions, these when you look at how what people believe in and what they ask for, you can figure out what it is that they're worried about, what are the deepest preoccupations. So that's what I try to do, and my way of doing it is to go as early as possible, and try to hear the voices of the devotees. And the investigations of the miracles are fantastic because there you hear the testimonies directly from the people who say they experienced the miracles.
Okay. Although Brother Carl Gaspar has a follow-up question, let me just give way to one question from our Facebook feed, and I would like to direct it to Mario. The question comes from Lemuel Dainla. Is it safe to say that these are clear expressions of that there are clear expressions of white supremacy and racism among Spaniards? How integral was race in the Spanish worldview? Perhaps can you connect the Sarswella with the issue of race, racial supremacy, and the like? Can you will you be able to answer that, Mario?
Well, yes, I think. Well, I mean, yes, because as I try to expose, it's not so simple. No, it's a three-dimensional space when talking about lyrical genres. And by the way, one of these ideas is just to expose to search more about, you know, the differences about the theaters, because some theaters maybe were for Spaniards and other were for the Tagalog comedy, and you know, and sometimes too at the ending of the 19th century, there were differences in the same theater, maybe. No, you know, this is the kind of stuff that I think that. I feel that there is that it must be sociological is the next step, no, you know, because first is to just to fulfill the lack of information, no, and when have to all this the stuff, the historiography that it is important to fulfill the lagoons of information. and then is this part of the sociological statements, no? But yes, indeed, you can read something between lines that there were some difference, you know, with the repertoire, by the way. And for example, there were opera, and in opera, but it is very interesting that the same performances, this is the interesting that it went in Thursday. There were performances in by the way Teatro Filipino, no, and then the same company just go to Tondo. But Tondo, it's another kind of you know, it's not the same situation. It's just for the entertainment of the weekend, and it's well, everybody, you know, well, not everybody, but Tondo, it's, you know, it's outside Intramuros. It's the other side of the river, and then but it's the same program, no. And there were other kind of hooks for the public. And by the way, one can look for too about, you know, that there is differences about this is miscellaneous, no, with the program. There are certain programs, I remember that I put, you know, this kind of the function where, you know, start at 8:30 or maybe 9, and there it's a long function, but the program were arranged with a different, so a few of differences, if there were in the Filipino, or maybe if there were in Tondo, no, yeah. There are, it is the next step. I think that the next step is just to look for this sociological statements on the Spanish Sarswella, and then with the operetta, no. And the same time that there were the all the fashions with American, by the way, you know, with the jazz and then the other moments of the vernaculars, more the divas like Atan de la Rama, you know. But it's more or less the same line, but it's just getting more branched, no. It's I think that I prefer just to still search, no, for this different levels of knowledge, no.
Thank you, Mario.
Okay.
And perhaps Brother Carl Gaspar's follow-up question is open to all three of you presenters, because Brother Carl Gaspar is asking how what theological discourse demonized the Muslims to the point where wars could be waged against them. I mean, one could make the argument that the intersections of race and religion are present in all three papers. The Moro Moro theater play, in terms of what Mario discussed, of course, the display of people in World's Fairs would also factor in race and religion, and of course, the emergence of evangelization, Christianity. So, any one of you, the three of you, any one of you, you're free to answer. Yes, Christina. Yeah,
so
feel free.
yeah, thank you for so you know, we need to remember that the Spanish were they were in the Philippines, but they really wanted to go to the Spice Islands. That's really where they wanted to go, and they didn't really give up until later, until like I think it was like 1667 when finally they gave up. They were trying to hold on to territories in Ternate and Tidore. And there were Muslims there. So there wasn't, you know, they wanted to be there. And so, and they always brought missionaries with them. And the missionaries wanted to convert the Muslims because, you know, they felt very strongly about that. And they carry with them, you know, the image that they carry with them was the Franciscans and Dominicans, the image of Our Lady of the Rosary, different, you know, they will put on banners and things like that. That was, I don't think there was debates going on in the in the Archbishop's office, and he had committees at different times. I mean, these are well known, a lot of meetings about the role of the missionaries and how to convert the natives. But I think the commercial interests were very strong, and those were the ones that really drove the Spanish wanting to go into the Spice Islands. So that's my answer for that, for in relation to my talk today. I don't know, maybe somebody else can address the issue of the Muslims in Mindanao and Sulu.
So I can't really speak to the demonization of Muslims, but what's particularly interesting is that by the time of the colonial exposition, when you're looking specifically at the pay stubs for these cultural performers, there's one individual who is Itneg, and he is being paid the same amount as the Catholic Visayan women. He was considered as an honorary Christian because of the fact that he spoke Spanish, he read Latin, he converted to Christianity, and also he actually assisted Spaniards in establishing some foothold or strongholds in Abra. So what's interesting is that this idea of savagery, or even the demonization of non-Christian Filipinos, is really porous and dependent specifically on not only their collaboration with Spanish colonial officials, but also their conversion to Catholicism.
Mario, you may want to weigh on that.
Yeah, well, about Muslims in Sarswella, well, especially in Zarzuela in the Philippines, Spanish Zarzuela in the Philippines. But I think that I remember. Well, I'm not an expert about Tagalog comedy, not about or Moro Moro. I'm not an expert, but at the Cuadros Filipinos by Entrala. In Entrada, well, he's always a little bit mocking, but very with taste about this the situation about the excess of the Tagalog comedy, especially because that there is this extravagant characters. And sometimes, especially because at the beginning, I know that it's the battle about with the Moors, no, the Christianity, the Christians with the Moors, and this is and inside this weird situation of the comedy, there is a kind of theater into the theater. Is very, very nice. If you can read whatever you can read this play by Entrala. The only thing that I can say is, well, it's just like he's trying always to mocking a little bit about the situation with the Moors, but especially something more serious, or into the repertoire, such as this into the Spanish Sarswella. I can't say anymore. No.
Thanks for that, Mario. Maybe one last question. We do have room for one final question. Anyone among the participants of this panel? So it looks like there's none. And with that, I would like to thank, on behalf of the conference committee, I would like to thank our presenters for this panel.
Sorry. Just for Caroline.
Sure.
Sure, I remember when she was just speaking about, you know, talking about the exhibition. No, I remember that maybe she knows better than me than I that there is an exhibit in Amsterdam. I don't know if it was in. I'm just trying here because I saw it that it's in 1883. No, it's before that the one that you're talking about. But it's the thing is just to I want just to read that because it's you know, because this is the kind of situation where you can feel that the Sarswella it was something very remarkable during that time, no? Because there is an actor, Jose Carvajal, who was the best esteemed. This is from a paper that I did 10 years ago, and I remember proof of his popularity is the curious object, which in order to show a sample of Philippine art, the government of Philippines sent to Europe. Quote, among the items which the Philippines sent for the expo exhibit in Amsterdam was a silver object consisting of a langkape, no, bank cane of finely worked silver, and beside it, tapanco, divider screen. I remember, I think that this is a biombo, well, in Spanish, which consists of the high relief portrait of the comedian Mr. Carvajal from the Filipino theater in the Zarzuela Torear por lo Fino. It was a very famous Sarswella, a Spanish Sarswella during the 19th century. At that moment when he prepares to sing with a pole in his shoulder. At the back of this object of his dedication to your is his dedication to your majesty, to whose hands the artist Ciriaco Godinez wishes to give the object to when the exhibit is over. No, this was the government from the Philippines sent to the Amsterdam exhibition. I think it was a kind of exhibition about colonies, I think. Well, I don't remember, but sure you know better, no? Okay, Caroline, it's just two.
So yeah, the 1883 Colonial Exposition was actually particularly interesting because in this exposition, there were several collections, not just of what is considered as part of the boundaries of the Spanish colonial empire, but even of individuals that were considered as heathens. So non-Christian Filipinos living around the boundaries or the borders of the Spanish colony were funded specifically to create objects for this 1883 Colonial Exposition. So it's particularly interesting because of the fact that they were looking and they were Spanish expositional organizers were actively recruiting individuals from throughout the archipelago to create objects that could be displayed at the 1883 exposition. Unfortunately, because I currently am living in Hawaii, it's so hard to get a hold of a lot of these archival materials needed to really delve into this discussion. But I've been looking at some of the catalogs relating specifically, the printed catalogs relating specifically to this 1883 exposition. But yeah, there's a lot that focuses really on musicality and this idea of drama embedded into objects as well as photographs. Yeah. But can you please send me your article? I would love to read it.
Okay, yeah, sure, indeed. Sure, indeed.
Thank you very much. And with that, we end our panel. Thank you very much, Christina, Mario, and Caroline for your wonderful presentations. We are now going on a break. The next session will begin 1:30 p.m. Manila time. And so we would like to invite you once again to attend the session. It's the keynote, the first keynote of our conference by Professor Javier Watbalang. We hope to see you all there 1:30 p.m. Manila time. So with that, thank you very much and have a good day.
Buenas noches desde Mexico.
Well, yes. Thank you, Mario.
But we see us. Bye.
Buenas noches.
Buenas noches.